Well, welcome everyone. My name is Margaret Biggs. I'm a Matthews Fellow in Global Public Policy at the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's University. Welcome to this policy talk, and thank you all for joining us today. To begin, let us begin by acknowledging that Queen's is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and we are very grateful to be able to live and learn and play on these lands. So today's policy talk is on an issue that has been top of mind and on the front pages over the past year and a half, with the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban in August 2021, the Russian invasion of Ukraine this year, both of which came on top of the fallout of the protracted civil war in Syria. Refugees and refugee settlement has been top of mind. And these are just three of the most recent refugee crises that the world and Canada have had to face. So I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Naomi Alboim. Naomi will speak to us about what we have learned from the way Canada has responded to these crises, to the Indochinese crises many years ago, Syrian, Afghan, and Ukrainian crises, and how that could inform our responses going forward, and what the key elements of success and progress might be. I can think of nobody in Canada who is better placed to speak to these issues than Naomi. She's a senior policy fellow at the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration, CERC, at the Toronto Metropolitan University, and she's a distinguished fellow and longtime contributor to the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University. Previously, Naomi worked at senior levels in both the Canadian federal government and the Ontario provincial government for over 25 years, including 8 years as Ontario Deputy Minister responsible for immigration, human rights, labor market training, as well as women's, seniors, disability, anti-racism, and indigenous issues. She's done it all. She's been involved in many different capacities, in a very leading capacity on the Indochinese, Syrian, Afghanistan, and the Ukrainian movements to Canada. She's the recipient of the Queen's Elizabeth II's Gold and Diamond Jubilee medals and is a member of the Order of Ontario. Naomi's going to speak to us for about 20-30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for a discussion period. We will use the Q&A function, the feature at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, for people to post their questions and comments. So don't put them in the chat box, put them in the Q&A feature, and I will pick them up from there. So I'm going to turn it over now to Naomi to speak to us on refugee crises and refugee immigration issues in Canada's response. Naomi.
Thank you, Margaret, for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be doing this, a pleasure to be doing something, if not physically at the School of Policy Studies, at least virtually. I have a long association with SPS, and it's wonderful to be back again. And welcome to the class of 2023, I guess. I think we call it from when you graduate. So welcome to you, to any of you who are there, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful year ahead. So as Margaret said, today I'm going to talk about the elements of successful refugee resettlement processes in Canada. But first, let me just give you some context. As of the beginning of 2022, almost 90 million people were displaced globally, including 27.1 million refugees and 4.6 million asylum seekers. The total stock of displaced people has accelerated rapidly over the last decade, and UNHCR statistics of 31.7 million people do not include the 6.9 million displaced from Ukraine, making it the largest and most rapid displacement crisis in the post-World War II era. As I'll discuss later in my talk, the international response to Ukraine stands in stark contrast to displacement from global South states. 7.1 million people remain displaced from Syria 12 years on from the start of the Syrian civil war, the majority of whom are hosted in neighboring states. An additional 6.5 million people have fled Venezuela and reside under various forms of protection and legal status throughout Latin America. Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East continue to host the majority of the world's refugees. 72% are hosted in neighboring states, and 83% are hosted in low and middle income countries. The world's least developed countries host 27% of displaced people globally. While the duration of displacement remains staggeringly high, global averages are skewed by dynamic conflict situations. For example, 2 million Afghans have been in exile for up to 40 years, while the majority of Syrians have been in exile for 10 years or less. Suffice it to say that most remain in regions of origin, with slim chances of returning home and very, very slim chances of being resettled to global northern states. Yet the number of refugees that are resettled remains staggeringly low compared to demand for durable solutions. From 2012 to 2021, just under 1 million refugees were resettled to third countries at an average of about 98,000 per year. 2020 and 2021 were the lowest years of resettlement in the last decade at 34,000 and 57,000 respectively, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Trump administration's defection from multilateral institutions, their extreme vetting of refugees in the resettlement pipeline, and anti-Muslim immigration policies. Just under 3.7 million returned to countries of origin over that period, with numbers varying widely year on year. The 2019 Global Refugee Forum resulted in a total of additional resettlement places overall, with 75% of those coming from Canada and the whole of the EU. In 2021, the UNHCR identified over 1.5 million persons with varying levels of urgent need, in need of protection through international resettlement. But for that 1.5 million individual, 1.5 million individuals, only 57,000 spaces were people were actually resettled. 57,000 out of 1.5 million. The Canadian government will be announcing the planned levels of immigration for the next 3 years sometime in October. When the last levels were announced in February 2022 for the years 2022 to 2024, the plan was to reduce refugee admissions from 76,000 in 2022 to 62,500 in 2024, despite the planned overall intake of all classes of immigrants to 51,000, a reduction of 18% of the flow to just 14% of the flow to Canada. This while the need for resettlement places continues to grow. So that's the context. And just to put it in context in one line, the work that Canada does in terms of resettlement is really important, but is really a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall need. But that means we have to do it well. And that means we have to see how we can even increase those numbers beyond what we do. So now to my actual topic for today. Responding to a refugee crisis is never easy. Despite strong humanitarian instincts, there are limits to what any country can do. And each refugee movement comes with its own complexities and challenges. Canada's experience with the Indochinese and Syrian refugee resettlement process has helped to highlight elements that are key to success. Recent responses to situations in Afghanistan and Ukraine are also instructive and can benefit from lessons learned as they continue to evolve. I've been involved, as Margaret indicated, in different capacities in all 4 of these major resettlement initiatives. And from those experiences, I strongly believe that refugee movements to Canada are most successful when three elements are present: government leadership, media coverage, and most importantly, public participation. Government leadership is exemplified when the federal government demonstrates a strong and sustained commitment, creates and implements responsive policies, programs, and vehicles for public participation, keeps information flowing to the media and the public. Partnerships with provincial and municipal governments are also critical for successful refugee resettlement. The media has the greatest impact when it galvanizes public opinion and awareness, which in turn strengthens government commitment and public participation. The media can also play an important role by maintaining a critical eye on government responses and keeping the public informed about what is happening, why, and how to become involved. Public participation means that civil society, the private sector, and individual Canadians are meaningfully engaged in various ways. Partnerships with civil society organizations can help to shape and implement refugee policies, programs. The private sector can provide goods, services, employment, and financial donations. And individual Canadians make an enormous contribution by serving as volunteers and sponsors, forming important connections with refugees and becoming their aware, informed advocates. Let's first look at how these played out in the Indochinese refugee movement. All three elements for success were at play during the second wave of Indochinese refugees. Although Canada's response had been relatively modest during the first wave from 1975 to 1976, government policy innovations and compelling media coverage contributed to a robust response, resulting in many more arrivals and unprecedented second wave, which occurred just a few years later. A new Immigration Act, which came into force in April 1978, set the stage for success. This was the first Canadian legislation to recognize refugees as a distinct class of immigrants and to enable private sponsorship. Regulations under the Act created a designated class for people from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, allowing them to be admitted without having to undergo formal determination as a convention refugee, and streamlining the formal selection process. This designation and the introduction of private sponsorship greatly facilitated the arrival of Indochinese refugees to Canada with significant levels of public participation. The government showed leadership through its commitment to increase government-assisted refugee spots by matching the number of privately sponsored Indochinese refugees. This acted as an incredible incentive to sponsor. It also created special programs in cooperation with provincial governments for unaccompanied minors and refugees with disabilities. Civil society organizations such as Operation Lifeline and Families for Children played important roles in engaging and supporting the sponsorship of Indochinese refugees and the placement of unaccompanied minors, respectively. Another highlight of the Indochinese movement was government's commitment to keep families intact. Visa officers on the ground in refugee camps were instructed to select entire extended family groupings, regardless of the degree of relationship. No family member left behind was the operational instruction. Later on, an orderly departure program allowed family members still in Vietnam to be reunited with their families in Canada directly, without the risk of having to escape to a country of first asylum. Such policies enabled families to help each other in resettlement without the constant worry about those left behind. The media was instrumental in heightening public interest in government action through intense coverage, including televised images of people drowning in the sea as they tried to escape. The government also took its communication role seriously, disseminating proactive messages through a weekly newsletter to stakeholders and the media, and keeping them abreast of developments. As described by a UNHCR representative in Canada, quote, "In Canada, individuals and groups were so moved by the plight of the Indochinese that they not only advocated for government action, but also organized a public response encouraging Canadians to rescue the Indochinese through the private sponsorship program. This movement was and a government who welcomed the opportunity to tap into the public concern of Canadians," end quote. Let's turn now to the Syrian refugee movement. Canada's response to the Syrian crisis is another example of media attention helping a modest approach to become much stronger. A photo of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi lying face down on the beach motivated many people to take notice and take action, and to demand that their government do the same. Syrian refugee resettlement became a 2015 election issue and a top priority for the new elected Liberal government. The new government quickly committed to ambitious goals and targets in collaboration with provinces, municipalities, and civil society. Canadians stepped up in droves to sponsor Syrian refugees or to donate money and goods. This was the first refugee movement with a strong role for federally funded settlement agencies across the country. Once again, civil society organizations such as Lifeline Syria emerged to facilitate private sponsorship. In the absence of a formal family reunification program for Syrian refugees, private sponsorship began to be used much more often for that purpose. The government showed leadership by deeming Syrians to be prima facie refugees. As such, Syrians did not have to undergo a formal determination of refugee status, which greatly facilitated private sponsorship by groups of 5 individuals or community groups. The government also increased the number of visa officers abroad, reinforcing them with significant resources from the military and other departments, created a coordinating body involving federal departments and provincial territorial governments, and held very regular briefings with the media. The Liberal platform initially provided no ceiling for privately sponsored refugees. This added a real incentive for people to become sponsors. But after the target of 25,000 admissions had been reached within a few months, enthusiasm turned to outrage and frustration when the government was slow to process many outstanding sponsorship applications and placed a cap on the total number of applications that could be submitted. In response to the public outcry, the cap was removed and admissions rose to 40,000 by the end of 2020. In both the Indochinese and Syrian refugee movements, research has shown that sponsored refugees tended to settle and integrate in Canada more effectively than government-assisted refugees. This was at least partially because of their social connections to their sponsors, the access they had to their sponsors' social and professional networks, and now the Afghan refugee movement. The Afghan refugee movement is rife with problems. This is in large part due to the brutal realities on the ground, which make it difficult to extricate people from a country now ruled by the Taliban, and to challenges in working with the neighboring countries hosting Afghans who have managed to escape. In addition, this movement has not garnered the level of sustained media attention and public participation that were evident in the Indochinese and Syrian movements. While there has been some strong media coverage, it has not been as prevalent or sustained as in the 2 other movements. Nor did Afghanistan become a major issue in the federal election, which took place in September 2021. The re-elected Liberal government honored its election platform commitment target from 20,000 to 40,000 over 2 years, but only around 19,000 have been admitted as of September 14th, 2022, more than a year after the Taliban takeover. More flights are due to arrive from the UAE and Tajikistan before the end of this month, and in early October. This will bring arrivals to just over 20,000. Despite the government's collaboration with allied countries and a significant infusion of resources, initial efforts were very slow, and progress has been difficult, in large part due to the deteriorating political situation in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. In addition, thousands of Afghans who have expressed their interest to come to Canada are still waiting for information about next steps. An arbitrary target of 18,000 for those who worked for the Canadian military or diplomatic corps flies in the face of the moral imperative to help people, specifically because they worked alongside Canadians to achieve our objectives in that country. And less than 8,000 of that 18,000 target have arrived to date. And with no Canadian military or diplomatic presence left in Afghanistan, there is no on-the-ground support apart from volunteer associations such as Aman Lara, comprised of Canadian veterans and former interpreters. Afghans who have escaped to Pakistan or other countries are often subject to harsh conditions and constantly changing entry and exit requirements, and now to floods and subsequent illness. The reality is that there are very few government mechanisms for significant public participation in the Afghan movement. Referral of individuals to the special resettlement programs established can only be made by organizations such as the UNHCR, the United States, the Department of National Defense, Global Affairs Canada, and designated human rights organizations. And the private sponsorship route remains virtually blocked. The vast majority of Afghans who have arrived under private sponsorship now are people who had been in the inventory for years, as opposed to individuals affected by the recent Taliban takeover. There is only a small family unification program for extended family members of Afghan interpreters who arrived in Canada in 2009 or 2012, but only 145 family members have arrived under that program to date. The possibility for new sponsorships has been extremely limited. There are large backlogs of unprocessed sponsorship applications for refugees from across the world and inadequate allocations for sponsorship agreement holders for the submission of new applications for Afghans. Another barrier is that the sponsorship of groups of five, by groups of five, or community groups requires individual refugee status determinations, which are very difficult or impossible to obtain. Like previous Lifeline organization, Lifeline Afghanistan is attempting to pursue sponsorships, but this aspect of its work is severely constrained due to all these challenges. On a positive note, Afghans who arrive in Canada as government-assisted or privately sponsored refugees are entitled to all the services and a wide network of excellent supports available to refugees and permanent residents. In addition, a National Afghan Resettlement Steering Committee is functioning well under joint leadership from the Immigration Department and the resettlement sector. Their work includes active engagement with Canadian veterans and associations of former Afghan interpreters. One of the committee's priorities is to encourage refugees to settle in smaller communities across Canada to reduce the pressure on housing and services, especially in large urban centres. But there has been little visible effort by the federal government, however, to keep the public and stakeholders apprised of both the progress being made and the challenges still faced. nor is there any apparent willingness to increase targets or avenues for family unification, despite the huge need. And finally, let's turn to the Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion and coming to Canada. The most striking feature of the government's response to people fleeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that it treats them as temporary residents and not as refugees. This innovative approach and the speed with which it was announced and implemented is evidence of strong government leadership to respond quickly to an urgent situation, but it has also created problems and concerns. Canada has a large Ukrainian community, a strong Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, and a Deputy Prime Minister who understands that part of the world well. These factors help to expedite government decision-making and contributed to the generosity of the approach. Ukrainians are eligible to receive emergency travel authorizations, to work or study in Canada, to stay for 3 years or more, and to receive priority processing to become permanent residents. There is no cap on the number of arrivals. The volume and speed of arrivals has been unprecedented. As of September 11, 2022, about 6 months after the Russian invasion, there have been approximately 87,000 arrivals of Ukrainian citizens and returning Canadian permanent residents of Ukrainian origin. As of September 24, 2022, approximately 560,000 applications were submitted for emergency travel and temporary resident permits, and close to 252,000 have already been approved. The government has also promised to develop a family unification program for both immediate and extended family members of Ukrainians in Canada. Questions remain about whether Ukrainians should have been treated as a refugee movement. To make them temporary residents is based on the assumption that they will return home or can find durable solutions elsewhere. The reality is that many Ukrainians who choose to come to Canada can be expected to stay, as borne out by recent surveys and previous experience with the refugees from Kosovo. In that case, Kosovars were airlifted to Canada on the assumption that they would return home when the conflict ended. However, 70% of them chose to stay, despite being offered funds and transportation to both return there and to resettle back home. The longer the war in Ukraine lasts, the more likely that individuals will stay in Canada. One downside of the government's decision regarding Ukrainians coming to Canada as temporary entrants is that temporary residents are not entitled to many of the government services and supports available to refugees. This has led to parallel systems and processes, lower benefits than refugees receive, and a heavy reliance on provincial and municipal governments and the private sector. It has also created confusion and different treatment across the country, with many people falling through the cracks. A coordinating committee co-chaired by RCC and the settlement sector, with representation from all provinces and the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, is helping to address these problems, but disparities remain. Another downside is that Ukrainians as non-refugees are ineligible for private sponsorship, which drastically reduces opportunities for public participation. Many Ukrainians have chosen to settle in large urban centers such as Toronto, creating enormous pressure on housing and other services in those locations. If Ukrainians were considered to be refugees, sponsorship would help to alleviate such pressure by attracting people to many communities across Canada where private sponsors reside. As we saw with the previous Indochinese and Syrian refugee movements, sponsors also use their social networks to help refugees obtain interim and permanent housing, employment, and the personal connections that are vital to successful integration. Sympathetic and sustained media coverage of the situation in Ukraine has helped to build public support for Canada's role in providing a safe haven for Ukrainians. However, commentators have also questioned whether there is a racial and religious component to the different as opposed to refugees from Afghanistan or other parts of the world. Despite the various concerns, the innovative approach government chose in response to the situation in Ukraine will be a valuable case study on the development, modification, and potential future use of non-traditional approaches for groups at risk. Future resettlement initiatives in response to refugee crises would benefit from a common framework that incorporates the best aspects of previous and current refugee responses: speed to get refugees in need here quickly, keeping families together and reuniting them quickly if they become separated, and providing consistent settlement and integration services to them, including access to refugee sponsorship. In conclusion, the three elements identified for successful refugee movements, government leadership, media coverage, and public participation, are interconnected. Government policies and programs only work if the public supports them. The positive tone and discourse to admitting refugees to Canada must be led by government to reduce the populist, anti-immigrant, and anti-refugee rhetoric sweeping many countries around the world. An engaged, knowledgeable, and committed public can spur government to exercise stronger leadership and action. Transparent government information about progress, challenges, and vehicles for participation will encourage the media to keep the issue on the front burner, and this in turn will motivate public engagement for the benefit of refugees. A virtual cycle, in fact. There is much to learn from prior movements that exemplify these features and from more recent innovations and experience. Reflecting on proven elements of success can help Canada to achieve its humanitarian objectives, provide models for other countries to adapt, and for Canada to benefit from the social, demographic, and economic contributions that successfully resettled refugees provide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I think it's a master class really in refugee issues and refugee settlements. So thank you very much for that. There's a question in the chat about in the Q&A. That's where you put your comments. Q&A around where to get this. Where your talk can be found, and I believe, and I'll just confirm that your talk will be posted on the Queen's Social SPS website. So to get us going, I just maybe I'll just start with one question myself, Naomi, and then there's some others coming in here. You talked about the differential impact, the differential responses, some of which were, every situation context is different, as you said. But thinking of across the four sectors or four issues that you identified, I just wanted to zero in a little bit on the Afghan issue. And also talk a little bit about the security issue, which you didn't really touch on, which seems to be at the heart of some of the concerns around not just the situation on the ground, but also the issue around how to process applications and et cetera. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more, because obviously the Afghan situation remains very difficult and sort of underachieved or undermanaged. And maybe talk about what more Canada or everybody should be doing with respect to the Afghan crisis.
I don't want to minimize the security issues at all. They are real, and they are real in every refugee situation. They were as real in the Syrian situation as they are in the Afghan situation. They were which some people don't remember, but there were significant security issues in terms of the Indochinese refugees. So the security clearances are really important, and they really have to be done. But they have to be done in in recognition of also the realities of the situation and who are likely to be people who are potentially more risky as security concerns and those that aren't. Large families with many children tend to be the least risky, and Canada's practice and policy against single men. But Canada's policy has really been focused on selecting families and bringing families, and we have benefited a lot from that. We have to be careful that we don't superimpose stereotypical reactions and use security as a rationale that goes beyond the real concerns. And there are concerns that in terms of the Afghan situation, what concerns are we really talking about? How many Taliban supporters would try to come to Canada pretending to be a refugee to do damage in Canada? I mean, it's not really that realistic to be concerned about that. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to take certain steps and certain precautions, absolutely, but we shouldn't let that be the nose that leads us. If I can leave it there.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Naomi. I've some questions are flooding in here. I'm going to start, Naomi, with one that's actually, we're going to zoom the aperture wider, broader, if I may, from just in Canada. So it's about the bigger issue. I'll just read it to you. Given that millions are displaced from their countries every year are displaced, as the numbers you gave, undoubtedly thousands who are settled in Canada benefit. But can any country resettle millions without completely changing the nation and their own nation and society? So the question is, what is the global solution to the production and settlement of refugees? The big question.
It's a big question, and one, Margaret, that you are equally well-placed, if not better well-placed, to respond to than I am. We have to look at the source causes that produce refugee situations. We have to use all the tools in our toolbox to try to prevent refugee situations, whether it is development assistance, whether it is really working in terms of the political route that we can play. There are, whether it is providing support to people who are displaced within their own countries to be able to remain in their own countries, although perhaps in a different part of that country, and what kind of international aid can be provided to make it feasible for people to stay in their home countries. We really, I think, have to put way more attention on neighboring countries and those host countries that do, in fact, take in millions. Many of them do have at least closely related cultures or languages, so integration is potentially more possible in neighboring countries than farther afield. But those host countries can't do it on their own. And as I said in my opening comments, the ones that neighbor the countries, in most cases, I'm not talking about, Ukraine, which is surrounded by the EU, but in most developing countries that where refugees exist, those neighboring countries are poor countries that really need help in providing the support that is necessary to integrate people rather than keeping them as an isolated group within their countries. So I think in terms of relative weight, the importance of the resettlement piece, although it's teeny in terms of numbers, and there are some things that we can do to grow those numbers, which I'll get to in a moment, but it's still relatively small. It's an incredibly important pressure valve. It's an incredibly important number of spaces to give hope to the host countries that are hosting so many more than the resettlement countries are, to take out the really most vulnerable refugees and to provide them with hope and resettlement in countries where there are the resources to help them to resettle, perhaps more effectively than in neighboring countries. And I think it does give hope to those host countries that they have not been forgotten and that there is some, there are other countries that are at least trying to help. So I think in terms of relative weight, trying to prevent refugee crises is probably number one. But in terms of money, I would think that supporting neighboring countries to help them do what needs to be done as well as can be done is next, and only a very, very and to help those that are most in need, potentially for resettlement to third countries like Canada.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Naomi. I'm going to give you two questions now. I'm going to put they're not related, although they could be, but just to sort of bundle them up. So the first one, very interesting. Here we are at Queen's, but the question is, how should universities and post-secondary institutions such as Queen's contribute to refugee settlement? And is there a unique role for us? And this is like a pop fly to center field for Naomi. And just noting that Queen's has 7 students through the WUSC, student refugee program, which I'm involved with WUSC, so I'm glad that there was a shout out for that. But that's just one aspect. So what can universities and post-secondary institutions be doing? That's the first question. I'm gonna bundle it with a second one, just because, and that has to do with LGBTQ refugee policies and how to consider their needs in these crisis situations, and who are often subject to either persecution in their own countries, or certainly when they are migrating and in refugee situations, they often are again subject to violence and persecution, and they aren't. So I just wanted to put those two together. You can address them separately.
Okay, thank you for both those questions. I particularly love I'm very glad that both questions were asked. In response to the first question, this is sort of music to my ears, because the role of universities and colleges right now is fairly minimal, important but minimal. And it can really be expanded hugely, in my view. And I've had conversations with the minister about this and have written papers about this. And there are some things that universities and colleges can really do. So first of all, the WUSC program is wonderful, but it is very small. And it needs to be enhanced, expanded. And I would argue that it needs to be, some of the criteria that it has right now are pretty limiting, because that also helps to limit the numbers. So, but universities that program could be expanded and some of the criteria expanded if there were some support provided. And if universities and colleges saw this as more of a priority than they do right now. The student involvement is there, but I think it would be wonderful if some of the support to WUSC to implement this program could be expanded so that its role could be expanded significantly. On the other hand, think about all the international students that come to Canada every year, and think about the criteria that existed and still exists on paper, but is being loosened a little bit now, that prevents students to come to Canada as students if they are refugees. Changing that one criteria publicly and formally and on the books, rather than with the wink, wink, nod, nod, which is what's happening now, would really allow universities and the student body and faculty and staff to play a very significant role in the sponsorship of refugees as permanent residents to Canada, with all the supports of the university environment, both students and faculty, the whole university community. They could be supported partially by on-campus jobs. So not, they wouldn't have to be 100% supported by funds raised by the university or college community. They could be provided with those jobs. But they coming in as permanent residents rather than as international students would give them access to all kinds of supports and services that they need, that frankly they're not necessarily getting as students on university or college campuses. So an integrated approach that would allow them to be sponsored on a permanent basis. I mean, the sponsor would not go on permanently, but their entry to Canada would be on a permanent basis. And I've written lots about how this could actually be implemented. And in some cases, it's already actually happening, but with small numbers. And we need to expand that. But think of that environment, the university and college environment. And this could be not just for, students who are youngins. It could be for older students. It could be for students with families, and you could bring in families under this initiative. Anyway, I think there is lots to be done. I've written extensively about this, and I'd be happy to share some of the papers that the minister was very excited about, by the way, and we'll see if anything happens along those lines. In terms of the second question, Canada is one of the few countries actually where sexual orientation does not disqualify them from entry to the country as a refugee. And Canada has been working quite extensively over a number of years to bring in more refugees who meet all the categories. And I think we can do more. I think we can bring in more. The question is the fear that people have to self-identify abroad, particularly in countries where they are really, really at risk. The people who most need to be able to qualify for Canadian refugee status in Canada are those in countries where they may fear approaching a Canadian visa officer, or may fear retribution if it's known that they have done so. So it's a tricky situation, but we have had a number of refugees coming into Canada very successfully and being settled very, very successfully, and we can do more.
Great, thank you, Naomi. I have some more big questions for you. So the first one I'm going to read to you, and I think it's basically asking you to boil down your waterfront on the various crises to say, okay, what could have been handled better and why. So the question is, while the public can and should criticize the government's responses, I personally think that Canada has done a great job in dealing with the Indochina, Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine crises. In your view, which of Canada's responses were particularly successful and why? Or flipping it around, which could have been handled much better and why?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I covered some of that in my talk in terms of how Canada accommodated to different situations and how they expanded the definitions in different situations. So I think the Indochinese was the first really big one. It was very different in many respects than what we are doing now, because we had a whole network of overseas officers, and we had who actually did the selection of refugees abroad rather than referring purely on UNHCR referrals. We had a whole network of government officials in Canada responsible for the settlement of refugees, the community sector to do that work. There are pros and cons to both, but I think having boots on the ground of Canadian immigration officers abroad, I think was really the way to go with the Indochinese movement. And frankly, we would benefit from that on the boots process of our people doing some of the selection rather than just getting referrals from the UNHCR. The UNHCR, does the best that it can. I do think that that's an element that we might want to look at what role Canada should play overseas rather than just relying on intermediaries. Focus me again on the question. Sorry, just the last part of the question.
Yeah, it was essentially what could we have done better overall, or what worked, I guess. And it is sort of asking the aha out of everything you just said. And I think that you just gave one of the key factors or elements, you think, to success.
Yeah, I think I'll go through them all because I've been involved with all of them. I mean, with the Indochinese refugee movement, it was the first time we did a really big kind of movement in a very short period. And we had lots of boots on the ground, and we got those boots on the ground from all over the place. People who were really committed but really knew both the immigration processes and the sort of realities of Canada. We weren't relying on other people to refer to us who didn't know very much about Canada. And I think that made a difference with the Indochinese. With the Syrian movement, there was not, and with the Indochinese movement, there was very little of an Indochinese community here in Canada. So we were flying blind a little bit. With the Syrian refugee movement, we tried to really involve the Syrian population in Canada as much as possible to help develop the response to the Syrian refugee crisis. And I think that made a difference. I think with the Afghan, we weren't fast enough with the Afghan movement. That's my biggest concern. I mean, we pulled out a long time before the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan. We had lots of connections there. And it wasn't as if the people with the connections didn't try to get Canada to act sooner, but Canada was very slow in acting and responding to the Afghan situation, which I think was really problematic. Quick response is something that I think we should have done better. The Afghan situation has become more complicated now because of the situation in Afghanistan and the situation in the neighboring countries, and the lack of Canadian presence, any Canadian presence in Afghanistan, except for some voluntary organizations. And that's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And I think it's very difficult when the neighboring countries aren't necessarily as cooperative as you need them to be in terms of providing the initial safe haven on the understanding that they're there temporarily and then will come to Canada, for example. And there hasn't been as much of a response from other countries to pick up on the Afghan situation. So, and with the most current situation, I think time will tell. I mean, it's a very, very, very generous way that Canada has responded, with no numbers being talked about. The policy was on the assumption that this was a temporary flow and that people would go back home when things settled. People are not going to go back home. And the ones who have decided to come to Canada are coming to Canada for a reason. Otherwise, they would be staying in Europe. If they really thought that they could just go back, they would be staying in Europe. They wouldn't be coming to Canada. And those that I think that these parallel systems now that have been created have caused delays and caused some difficulties, frankly, because the normal mechanisms for refugee resettlement are not necessarily being utilized, and we've been sort of making things up as we go along and then changing things to make it. So the recent movement has, I mean, you know, it's been great, lots and lots of people, and lots of learnings that we can get from this. But bringing in people on a temporary basis and using only the temporary mechanisms for the resettlement and then saying, oh, that's not working, maybe we have to adapt it this way, adapt it that way, or adapt it this way, is not necessarily the best way. With the, oh, my mind has now gone blank.
Don't go blank, because I got 2 more questions for you.
Okay, I will stop there.
Okay. Well, you already gave us a lot. Listen, we have another minute or two, and I am, Naomi, I'm going to throw 2 biggies at you.
Minute or two. Great.
Yeah. So, just before we wrap, okay. And the first one is huge, and and here it is. Are you confident that Canadian support for large immigration and refugee programs will remain solid? Do you worry about polarization in attitudes? And the possibility of a backlash that we're seeing in some other countries? Big question from a friend of yours. And the last question, it would be a 10-second answer. In your opinion, what should be the #1 priority for the government of Canada to change policies to better respond? If they could do one thing, what would it be? So if you could answer those 2 in a minute and a half, be very grateful.
Okay, the first was, tell me in a nutshell. I did make a note. I'm terribly sorry. Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Margaret. I can't hear you. You're muted.
There's been a fairly settled consensus around immigration and refugees. We can discuss that in Canada. But do you worry about polarization and attitudes around immigration and refugees that we're seeing in other countries? Are you worried about a backlash?
Okay, well, okay, one of the best ways to eliminate a backlash is by involving as many people as possible in the resettlement of the refugees. And those personal relationships that are established between sponsor groups and refugees, and between every member of a sponsor group and everybody there in their entire world. Because let me tell you, I mean, I've been involved in refugee sponsorship, and it is the most amazing experience you can possibly have. So the more we have members of the general public involved in the resettlement of refugees, the better off we are, both in terms of the resettlement of those refugees and in terms of developing a strong level of support in the nation for continued involvement in refugee issues. If refugees come in and are purely government assisted, and there is no involvement of Joe and Jane Q public, there will be less support and more concern. And that's why I didn't say that specifically, but that's one of my real concerns about both the Afghan and the Ukrainian movements now. With the Afghan movement, there is very little private sponsorship, and therefore very little on the ground involvement with the Afghan refugees. And similarly with the Ukrainians, I think the support they're getting primarily is from the Ukrainian community, but there isn't sort of the widespread general support. And I think that that is critical. And that has served Canada very, very well in terms of maintaining Canada's support for refugee resettlement going forward.
Okay, then. So because I'm going to have to wrap up, if I could put words in your mouth to answer the last question I posed to you, if you could do one thing, if you were going to be seeing the minister at lunch today, what if you could tell him to do one thing, what would it be?
I have conversations with the minister more than just once, and I cannot restrict myself to one thing.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair
Um,
enough. And you've given us a lot already. Yeah.
I mean, I think Canada has been a leader internationally, has to continue being a leader internationally. We need to maintain a strong government sponsorship process of refugees along with the private sponsorship of refugees. We cannot put everything on the backs of its citizens, nor can we put it purely on the government. There has to be this dual approach that works in concert.
Naomi, this is amazing. Thank you very much. You gave us so much, and people will need to follow up and read your papers, particularly around what universities and colleges can do. Thank you very, very much. And thank you to our listeners and participants, some great questions. So I'm going to close it off now, and just want to, before people sign off, I want to tell you about a couple of things. There are two great named lectures next week. The first one on Thursday at 4:30 p.m. Well, no, they're not both next week, but the Thursday next week at 4:30 p.m. we have the Duncan G. Sinclair Lectureship in Health Services and Policy Research, and it's going to feature Dr. Chris Simpson. And then on Thursday, September the 29th, we welcome Professor Melissa Kearney from the University of Maryland, who will deliver the J. Douglas Gibson Lecture. Both really prominent scholars and experts in their field. All the information can be found on the School of Policy Studies website. So follow up there. And Naomi's talk will be on the school's YouTube channel. So on behalf of everybody, Naomi, thank you again very, very much. And thank you to the audience for your questions and your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.